Hey guys, welcome to RedSunStories. Hope you're doing well. Tonight, we're exploring Japan's most famous ghost story, the story of Oiwa, famously known as Yotsuya Kaidan. So before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments what time it is for you. I would love to connect with you guys. Now, let's dive into tonight's story together. In the depths of a moonless night, where shadows dance between the ancient cedars of old Japan, there exists a house that time has forgotten. Its wooden walls, once polished and proud, now sag under the weight of decades and the burden of terrible secrets. The tatami mats within have grown soft with moisture and neglect, and the shoji screens hang in tatters like the remnants of broken dreams. It is here, in this forsaken place, that our tale begins, a story of love betrayed, of beauty destroyed, and of a vengeance that transcends the boundary between life and death. The mist rolls in from the distant mountains, creeping through the valleys like ghostly fingers seeking to caress the earth. Tonight, it settles thick around this abandoned dwelling, as if drawn by some invisible force that pulses within its rotting beams. The silence is complete, save for the occasional groan of settling wood and the whisper of wind through broken eaves. Yet those who dare to pass this place in the darkest hours speak of other sounds, the soft padding of bare feet across creaking floors, the rustle of silk kimono, and sometimes, carried on the night breeze, the faintest echo of a woman's lament. Her name was Oiwa, and her story begins not in death, but in the flowering of young love beneath cherry blossoms that have long since turned to dust. In the time when the Tokugawa shogunate held firm control over Japan, when the rigid order of society seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves, there lived a woman whose beauty was spoken of in whispered reverence throughout the district of Yotsuya. Oiwa was her name, and she moved through the world with the grace of a willow branch dancing in spring wind. Her hair fell like a black waterfall to her waist, and her eyes held the depth of mountain pools at twilight. When she smiled, it was said, even the most hardened samurai would pause in wonder. She dwelt in a modest house with her father, a masterless samurai who had lost his lord's favor through no fault but loyalty to outdated principles. Though their circumstances had grown humble, Oiwa carried herself with the dignity of her lineage, tending their small garden with hands that seemed to coax life from the very earth. The chrysanthemums bloomed larger under her care, the bamboo grew straighter, and the koi in their tiny pond swam in patterns that resembled ancient calligraphy. It was in this garden that she first met Ayamon Tamiya, a ronin whose own fortunes had fallen upon hard times. He came seeking her father's counsel on a matter of honor, but found his attention captured entirely by the vision of Oiwa kneeling beside the lotus pond, her reflection rippling in the dark water like a dream given form. When she looked up and their eyes met, something passed between them that neither could name. A recognition, perhaps, or a premonition of the fate that would bind them together in ways both beautiful and terrible. Their courtship unfolded with the measured rhythm of the seasons. Yemen would arrive each evening as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, bearing small gifts, a rare flower, a poem written on handmade paper, once a hairpin carved from ivory that caught the light like captured moonbeams. Oiwa would receive these tokens with a shy smile that grew warmer with each passing day, and they would walk together through the garden paths, speaking of dreams and plans for a future that seemed as certain as the rising sun. When autumn came with its freight of red and gold leaves, Imon formally asked for Oiwa's hand. The ceremony was small but perfect, conducted in the garden under the ancient maple tree that had sheltered 3 generations of her family. As they pledged their love beneath its scarlet canopy, the very air seemed to shimmer with promise. Oiwa wore her grandmother's silk kimono, decorated with cranes in flight, symbols of eternal fidelity and longevity. The sake they shared tasted of honey and hopes, and when night fell, they retired to their new home as husband and wife, believing that nothing in heaven or earth could separate what their hearts had joined. For a time, their happiness seemed as enduring as the mountains that ringed their valley. Oiwa proved herself a devoted wife, managing their household with skill that belied her gentle nature. She could make a feast from the simplest ingredients, could mend Aimon's clothing so perfectly that the repairs were invisible, could transform their modest rooms into a sanctuary of peace and beauty, with nothing more than careful arrangement of seasonal flowers and the soft glow of paper lanterns. When she discovered that she carried their child, her joy was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She would sit in the garden in the early morning, one hand resting on her growing belly, speaking softly to the life within her. She told the unborn child stories of its ancestors, sang lullabies that her own mother had sung, made plans for the day when small hands would help her tend the flowers and chase fireflies in the summer dusk. But even in those golden days, there were shadows gathering at the edges of their happiness. Iemon's work as a masterless samurai brought little income, and pride prevented him from accepting the charity of Oiwa's remaining relatives. He would disappear for days at a time, seeking employment or attempting various schemes to improve their fortunes. Each time he returned empty-handed, Oiwa could see the frustration building in his eyes, a darkness that seemed to grow deeper with each failed endeavor. Still, she loved him with the unwavering devotion that had marked her character since childhood. When their daughter was born, a perfect child with her mother's delicate features and her father's strong spirit, Oiwa believed that this new life would restore Yemen's joy and purpose. For a brief time, it seemed her faith was justified. He would spend hours simply watching the baby sleep, his face soft with wonder and protective tenderness. But the pressures of providing for his family, the daily reminder of his failure to achieve the prosperity he had promised, began to eat away at his contentment, like acid on fine metal. It was during this time of growing strain that fate introduced the poison that would destroy everything Oiwa held dear. The Ito family had long been among the most prosperous merchants in their district, their wealth built on shrewd investments and careful cultivation of influential connections. Ito Kihei was a man who understood that in the rigid hierarchy of their society, money could purchase what birth had not provided: respect, access, and the power to shape one's own destiny. His daughter Ume possessed a beauty that was perhaps less ethereal than Oiwa's, but was enhanced by the confidence that came from never knowing want or worry. When Kihei first laid eyes upon Yemen at a local festival, he saw not a struggling ronin, but a man of noble bearing who could provide his daughter with the samurai lineage that money alone could not buy. The fact that Aiemon was already married seemed to Kihei merely an obstacle to be overcome, like a boulder in a stream that could be diverted with sufficient effort and patience. The courtship, if it could be called that, began with small offers of assistance. When Aiemon mentioned his need for work, Kihei found reasons to employ him on various tasks, some legitimate, others clearly manufactured to provide excuses for payment. When Oiwa fell ill after her difficult childbirth, requiring expensive medicines, Kihei's generosity seemed like the answer to desperate prayers. The gifts came with no apparent strings attached, offered with such casual kindness that accepting them seemed not only reasonable, but almost churlish to refuse. Gradually, subtly, Kihei began to suggest that Iemon's talents were wasted in his current circumstances. A man of his abilities, his bearing, his noble heritage, deserved better than the hand-to-mouth existence he was enduring. Oume, he mentioned casually, had confessed her admiration for Iemon's character and appearance. Perhaps, if circumstances were different, if certain obstacles could be removed, arrangements could be made that would benefit everyone involved. At first, Iman recoiled from these suggestions with the horror they deserved. He loved Oiwa, he declared, and would never betray the trust she had placed in him. Their marriage was sacred, their child a bond that death itself could not sever. But Kihei was patient and persistent, and he understood the particular weakness that poverty could create in an honorable man's resolve. Each month that passed with their situation growing more desperate, each time Oiwa had to make their meager resources stretch further, each occasion when he had to watch his wife go without so that their daughter might have what she needed. All of these became weapons in Kihei's careful campaign. The final assault on Iman's conscience came in the form of medicine for Oiwa herself. Her health, never robust since the difficult birth, had been declining steadily. She tried to hide her weakness from her husband, but he could see the way she had to pause sometimes while working, the way her face had grown pale and drawn, the way she forced herself to smile when she thought he was watching. When Kihei appeared with a bottle of expensive tonic, claiming it would restore her strength and vitality, Iemen found himself faced with an impossible choice. The medicine that Kihei provided was indeed powerful, but not in the way he had promised. Instead of healing Oiwa, it began to slowly destroy the very beauty that had first captured Iman's heart. Day by day, her lovely face began to change, her smooth skin erupting in terrible sores, her lustrous hair falling out in clumps that she tried desperately to hide. The transformation was so gradual that at first she attributed it to her lingering illness, but as weeks passed and the damage became impossible to ignore, she began to suspect the truth. Iman, tormented by guilt but too weak to confess his role in her suffering, could only watch in growing horror as his wife's beauty was stripped away. The sight of her ravaged face became a daily reminder of his own corruption, and what had begun as reluctant participation in Kihei's scheme transformed into desperate desire to escape the consequences of his choices. When Oiwa finally confronted him with her mirror, showing him what she had become, demanding to know why he could no longer bear to look at her, his shame and self-loathing erupted in the cruelest possible way. "You are no longer the woman I married," he told her, his voice cold as winter wind. "How can I love what you have become?" The words hit Oiwa like physical blows, and she staggered backward, the mirror slipping from her nerveless fingers to shatter on the tatami mat. In those broken fragments, she saw not only her destroyed reflection, but the truth of her husband's betrayal written in his eyes. She saw the plans he had made, the new life he had chosen, the ease with which he was prepared to discard her, like a broken toy. That night, as Iman made his final preparations to leave her for his new bride, Oiwa sat alone in their daughter's room, holding the sleeping child and whispering apologies for the legacy of pain she would inherit. The rage and despair that filled her heart seemed to burn like acid in her veins, and she found herself speaking words that came from some deep, dark place she had never known existed within her gentle soul. "If you abandon us," she whispered to the empty air, knowing somehow that Iemen could hear her words despite the walls between them. If you destroy what we built together for the promise of gold and a prettier face, then I swear by all the kami and all the spirits of our ancestors that my love will become your curse. I will follow you beyond death itself, and you will never know peace again. The morning brought no relief from the terrible tension that had settled over their household like a funeral shroud. Yemen moved through the rooms like a stranger, gathering his possessions with mechanical efficiency while avoiding Oiwa's eyes. She watched him from the doorway of their daughter's room, her ravaged face a mask of composure that concealed the storm of emotions beneath. Their child, too young to understand the destruction of her world, played quietly with her wooden toys, occasionally looking up at her parents with the instinctive concern that even infants possess when the adults around them are in distress. When Eamon finally faced her to announce his intentions formally, his voice carried the flat tone of a man reciting words he had rehearsed but did not believe. He spoke of duty to his family line, of opportunities that could not be missed, of practical considerations that outweighed personal sentiment. He did not mention love, either lost or found, and the careful absence of that word hung between them like an accusation. Oiwa listened in silence until he finished his prepared speech, then spoke with a calmness that seemed to unnerve him more than tears or pleading might have done. "And what of our daughter?" she asked simply. "What becomes of the child who carries your blood and bears your name?" For the first time since beginning his recitation, Eamon hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the room where their daughter played, and something that might have been regret flickered across his features. But when he spoke again, his voice had regained its cold certainty. "She will be provided for," he said. "The Ito family has resources. Arrangements will be made." "Arrangements," Oiwa repeated softly, as if tasting the word and finding it bitter. "Like the arrangements made for my medicine? Like the arrangements that turned my face into this ruin you can no longer bear to see?" Eamon's composure cracked slightly, and she saw the guilt he had been struggling to hide. For a moment, she thought he might confess everything, might fall to his knees and beg her forgiveness for the terrible thing he had done. Instead, he turned away, shoulders rigid with the effort of maintaining his resolve. "What's done is done," he said. "We must all live with the consequences of fate." "Fate," Oiwa whispered, and now there was something in her voice that made him glance back despite himself, a quality that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her damaged throat, darker than her broken heart. "Is that what you call it when a man destroys his wife's beauty to justify abandoning her? Is that fate, Eamon?" He left without answering, and Oiwa stood in the doorway watching his retreating figure until it disappeared into the morning mist. Only then did she allow herself to collapse, her careful composure finally crumbling as the full weight of her abandonment settled upon her shoulders. But even in her grief, she could feel something else growing, a cold fire that seemed to burn without consuming, a purpose that transcended the merely personal anguish of a betrayed wife. The next days passed in a strange suspension of normal time. Neighbors brought food and offered awkward condolences, but Oiwa barely acknowledged their presence. She moved through her daily routines like a woman walking in her sleep, caring for her daughter with mechanical precision, while her mind dwelt in darker realms. The mirror remained broken where it had fallen, its fragments scattered across the tatami like frozen tears, and she made no effort to clean them up. It was on the third night after Yemen's departure that the final, unforgivable betrayal occurred. Oiwa had fallen into an exhausted sleep beside her daughter's futon when she was awakened by the sound of footsteps on the wooden walkway outside. For a moment, her heart leaped with the hope that Eamon had returned, that conscience had finally overcome ambition. But the footsteps were too heavy, too purposeful, and when she slid open the shoji screen, she found herself facing not her husband, but Kihei himself, accompanied by two men she did not recognize. "Forgive the intrusion at such a late hour," Kihei said, though his manner suggested he felt no need for forgiveness. "But there are matters that require immediate attention." He pushed past her into the room without waiting for invitation, his companions following with the casual confidence of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. Oiwa's daughter stirred restlessly at the disturbance, and she instinctively moved to place herself between the child and these unwelcome visitors. "What do you want?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. Kihei's smile was cold and businesslike. "Your husband has agreed to certain arrangements regarding his future. Unfortunately, your continued presence in this house creates complications. We are here to resolve those complications." The men with him moved with practiced efficiency, one restraining Oiwa while the other approached the sleeping child. The sight of strange hands reaching for her daughter shattered Oiwa's shock and brought forth a fury she had not known she possessed. She fought with the desperate strength of a mother protecting her young, but she was weak from grief and illness, and her struggles only delayed the inevitable. "Please," she gasped as they bound her hands with rough rope. "She's just a baby. She's done nothing to deserve this." "The child will be well cared for," Kihei said, his tone suggesting the discussion was already concluded. "She will be raised in a household that can provide properly for her needs. You, however, have become an obstacle to progress." They forced her to drink a cup of sake that burned like liquid fire in her throat and tasted of bitter herbs she could not identify. Almost immediately, her vision began to blur and her limbs grew heavy with an unnatural lethargy. As consciousness slipped away, she could hear her daughter beginning to cry, a sound that seemed to echo in the gathering darkness like the wail of lost souls. When she awoke, she found herself in a place she did not recognize, a small hut deep in the woods, far from any human habitation. Her hands were still bound, and the drug they had given her left her weak and disoriented. Through the single window, she could see only endless trees stretching into misty darkness, and the silence was so complete that it seemed to press against her eardrums like a physical weight. For 3 days, they kept her prisoner in that isolated place, bringing her barely enough food and water to sustain life. Kihei visited once, accompanied by a man he introduced as a physician, though his manner suggested a different kind of professional entirely. They spoke in low voices outside the hut, their words lost in the whisper of wind through the leaves, but she could guess the nature of their discussion from the way they looked at her when they thought she was not watching. On the 4th night, when the moon was dark and the forest seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, they came for her with rope and a cloth soaked in some sweet-smelling substance that made her thoughts scatter like startled birds. She fought them with the last of her strength, calling out to any kami who might hear her desperate prayer, but her voice was swallowed by the vast indifference of the woods. "Please," she whispered as they carried her deeper into the trees, to a place where an old well yawned like a mouth in the earth. "I have done nothing but love faithfully. I have harmed no one. Why must I pay for another's greed?" But there was no answer, save the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a night bird that sounded almost like a child crying. They bound her hands and feet with ceremony, as if performing some ancient ritual, then lowered her into the dark water that waited at the bottom of the well. As the cold closed over her head and her lungs filled with the bitter taste of stagnant water, Oiwa's last coherent thought was not of revenge or justice, but of her daughter sleeping alone in a strange house, calling for a mother who would never answer. And in that moment of absolute despair, something fundamental shifted in the very fabric of the world. Death, when it came, was not the ending Oiwa's tormentors had expected. The waters of the abandoned well that claimed her broken body seemed to reject what they had been given, churning and bubbling with an unnatural agitation that sent ripples across the surface long after her struggles had ceased. The very earth around the well began to change, the grass withering in expanding circles, the nearby trees dropping their leaves out of season, as if winter had descended on that single spot, while the rest of the forest remained untouched. But these were merely the first signs of what was to come. In the realm between life and death, where spirits linger when their earthly business remains unfinished, Oiwa's consciousness reformed with a clarity and purpose that transcended anything she had known in life. The love that had once filled her heart had been transformed by betrayal and murder into something far more powerful and infinitely more dangerous. A hunger for justice that would not be satisfied by the mere passage of time. 3 nights after her body had been consigned to the depths of the well, Yaemon Tamiya knelt in the formal gardens of the Ito estate, participating in the wedding ceremony that would make him the heir to wealth and position he had always craved. The sake he drank tasted sweet on his lips, and the silk of his new bride's kimono rustled pleasantly in the evening breeze. Ume's face, framed by the elaborate headdress that marked her as a bride, seemed to glow with happiness and anticipation, and for long moments at a time, Yaemon could almost forget the price he had paid for this new beginning. The ceremony proceeded with flawless precision, each ritual gesture performed exactly as tradition demanded. Incense burned in delicate spirals toward the star-scattered sky, and the soft chanting of the priests created an atmosphere of sacred solemnity. When it came time for the final exchange of cups, when their union would be sealed before gods and men, Iman felt a surge of satisfaction that seemed to wash away the lingering shadows of guilt that had haunted him since leaving his former life behind. But as he raised the ceremonial cup to his lips, the sack within began to change. What had been clear and golden became dark as old blood, and floating on its surface was a reflection that made his hands shake so violently that drops spilled onto his white wedding robes like tears of accusation. For there, staring back at him from the liquid, was Oiwa's face as it had been on the last day he saw her, ravaged by the poison he had administered, twisted with the agony of ultimate betrayal, but unmistakably alive with an intelligence and fury that death had not diminished. The cup fell from his nerveless fingers, shattering on the stone pathway and sending its contents spreading like a pool of accusation. The guests gasped at this terrible omen, and the priests began to mutter prayers for purification. But Yaemon could only stare at the broken pieces and wonder if anyone else had seen what he had seen. When he looked up, seeking reassurance in the faces around him, he found only concern and confusion, and he began to hope that the vision had been merely a product of his own guilty conscience. But as the ceremony continued and the guests moved into the house for the wedding feast, Yaemon became aware of other disturbances that could not be so easily dismissed. The paper screens that lined the corridors began to rattle without any discernible cause, creating a sound like dry bones clicking together in some macabre rhythm. The carefully arranged flowers wilted and turned black as he passed, filling the air with the sickly sweet scent of decay. And everywhere he looked, he caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, a flutter of torn silk, the gleam of long black hair, the pale suggestion of a face that watched him with eyes that held the darkness of the well. The wedding night that followed was a nightmare of anticipation and dread. As Ume prepared for bed, humming softly to herself in the innocent happiness of a new bride, Yemon found himself starting at every shadow, tensing at every sound. When she finally joined him on the sleeping mat, her skin warm and soft against his, he tried to lose himself in her embrace and forget the visions that had plagued him during the ceremony. But even as he held her close, even as he murmured words of love and devotion that he genuinely meant, he could not shake the feeling that they were not alone in the darkened room. It was in the deepest hour of the night, when even the insects had fallen silent, and the moon hung like a pale eye above the sleeping house, that Oiwa finally announced her presence with unmistakable clarity. Yemen woke to find the room filled with a cold that seemed to seep into his very bones, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with an unnatural luminescence. Beside him, Ume slept on, her breathing deep and peaceful, but when he turned to look at her face, the scream that rose in his throat was stifled by sheer terror. For the features he saw on the pillow beside him were no longer those of his new bride, but the ruined visage of his murdered wife. Oiwa's eyes, clouded with death, but burning with inexorable purpose, stared into his with an intensity that seemed to pierce through to his very soul. Her mouth, discolored and distorted by the poison that had destroyed her beauty, curved in a smile that held no warmth, no forgiveness, only the promise of retribution that would follow him to the ends of the earth. "Did you think," she whispered in a voice like wind through autumn leaves, "that death would silence me? Did you believe that murder would free you from the vows we made beneath the maple tree?" Ayman tried to move, tried to cry out, but found himself paralyzed by a terror so complete that it seemed to stop the very beating of his heart. Oiwa's apparition leaned closer, and he could smell the dank water of the well on her breath, could feel the cold radiating from her spectral form like ice in winter. "I have seen our daughter," she continued, each word falling like drops of poison into his consciousness. "I have watched her cry for the mother who will never return, have seen how she reaches for arms that cannot hold her. The Ito family treats her well enough, feeds her and clothes her, and gives her shelter. But they cannot give her love. They cannot replace what you destroyed when you chose gold over honor, beauty over faithfulness." The vision of Um's face began to shift and change, the features melting like wax in flame, until what lay beside him was something that belonged neither to the living nor the dead, a constantly shifting amalgamation of the two women whose lives he had destroyed, beautiful and terrible by turns, a walking reminder of the price of his betrayal. "Every night," Oiwa's voice promised, "I will come to you. Every time you close your eyes, you will see what your choices have wrought. Every moment of happiness you steal will be paid for with interest, until you understand the true weight of what you have done." And then she was gone, vanishing like morning mist, leaving only the scent of stagnant water and the echo of words that seemed to resonate in his bones. Beside him, Ome stirred restlessly, murmuring in her sleep, her face once again her own, but somehow forever changed in his perception. For now, he would never be able to look at her without remembering what he had seen, never be able to touch her without feeling the cold of the grave, never be able to love her without being reminded of the love he had destroyed. As the gray light of dawn began to filter through the paper screens, Yemen lay motionless and staring, understanding with terrible clarity that his punishment had only just begun. In the days that followed that first terrible visitation, Ayman tried desperately to convince himself that what he had experienced was merely a dream born of guilt and exhaustion. He threw himself into his new role as the Ito family's son-in-law with fevered intensity, attending to business matters with an attention to detail that impressed his father-in-law and earned the admiration of the other merchants. During the daylight hours, surrounded by the bustle of commercial activity and the reassuring solidity of ledgers and contracts, he could almost believe that the supernatural had no place in his orderly new world. But as each evening approached and shadows began to lengthen across the floors of the Ito house, dread would settle on him like a physical weight. He began to drink more sake than was wise, hoping that alcohol might dull his perceptions and grant him peaceful sleep. But instead, it seemed only to make the visions more vivid and terrible. He tried sleeping in different rooms, thinking perhaps that Oiwa's spirit was somehow bound to the place where he had first seen her, but her presence followed him wherever he went, patient and inexorable as the turning of the seasons. Aume, still glowing with the happiness of a new bride, remained blissfully unaware of the supernatural drama unfolding around her. She attributed her husband's increasingly haggard appearance to the pressures of adjusting to his new responsibilities, and she tried to comfort him with gentle ministrations that only intensified his guilt. When she would massage his tense shoulders or brew special teas to help him sleep, he could see Oiwa's face reflected in her concerned eyes, could hear his dead wife's voice whispering accusations through her words of love. The haunting took many forms, each more disturbing than the last. Sometimes Imon would catch glimpses of Oiwa in crowds, her ruined face turning toward him with that terrible smile, before disappearing into the press of bodies. Other times, he would hear her voice calling his name from empty rooms, would follow the sound only to find nothing but shadows and the lingering scent of decay. The servants began to whisper among themselves about strange sounds in the night, about cold spots that appeared in warm rooms, about the way certain mirrors in the house would crack without explanation. Most disturbing of all were the transformations. With increasing frequency, Yemen would turn to look at his wife and find Oiwa's features superimposed over Ume's, as if his first wife's spirit was slowly possessing the body of her replacement. These episodes lasted only moments, but they left him shaken and disoriented, uncertain of what was real and what was the product of his guilt-driven madness. The climax of these manifestations came on the night of the full moon, exactly 1 month after Oiwa's murder. Yemen had retired early, pleading illness, and lay restlessly on his sleeping mat, while Ume performed her evening ablutions. Through the thin walls, he could hear her humming the same song she had sung on their wedding night, a simple melody that spoke of contentment and trust. The sound should have soothed him, but instead, it filled him with a nameless dread, as if something in the very air around him was preparing to shift and change. The transformation, when it came, was so gradual that at first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen and move, coalescing into shapes that resembled furniture he remembered from his old house. The low table where he and Oiwa had shared their meals, the standing mirror she had used while arranging her hair, the wooden cradle where their daughter had slept. As these phantom objects solidified, the room itself began to change. the fine silk hangings of the Ito house fading to be replaced by the simpler decorations of his former home. When Ume entered the room, her face bore an expression of confusion that quickly transformed into terror as she looked around at the transformed space. But when she opened her mouth to speak, it was Oiwa's voice that emerged, cold and filled with righteous fury. Do you see now how thin the barriers are between past and present, between the living and the dead? The apparition asked, moving toward him with the gliding step of a spirit that no longer felt the pull of earthly gravity. Do you understand that there is no distance great enough, no amount of wealth sufficient to free you from the consequences of your choices? Eamon tried to flee, but found his legs would not obey him. He was forced to watch as the specter that wore his new wife's face but spoke with his old wife's voice began to tell the story of their daughter, how the child cried herself to sleep each night, how she had grown thin and wan from grief, how she asked constantly for her mother and could not understand why her questions were met with silence and evasion. She is forgetting my face, Oiwa's spirit revealed, and the pain in those words was like a blade twisted in his heart. Each day that passes, my image grows dimmer in her memory, and soon she will have no mother at all, only the vague ache of loss that will follow her through all her days. This is what you have given her in exchange for your momentary happiness. The vision continued throughout the night, a relentless parade of images showing him the true cost of his betrayal. He saw his daughter growing up in the Ito household, treated kindly enough, but always marked as an outsider, always wondering why her father could not bear to look at her for more than a few moments at a time. He saw the questions she would ask as she grew older, the gradual realization that something terrible had happened to fracture her family, the way suspicion and shame would shadow her throughout her life. But perhaps most terrible of all were the glimpses of what might have been, scenes of the life he had destroyed, showing him the happiness he had sacrificed for material gain. He saw himself and Oiwa growing old together, their love deepening with the years, despite their poverty. He saw their daughter surrounded by siblings, part of a family bound together by genuine affection, rather than social convenience. He saw quiet evenings by the fire, simple meals shared with gratitude, the profound satisfaction that comes from choosing honor over advantage. When dawn finally broke and the visions faded, Eamon found himself alone in his transformed room, which had returned to its original state as if nothing had happened. Ume was nowhere to be seen, and when he stumbled through the house searching for her, he discovered her in her father's study, weeping inconsolably while Kihei tried to comfort her. She says she had the most terrible dreams, Kihei explained when he saw Eamon's haggard appearance. She dreamed she was someone else, someone who had been murdered, and she could not make the dream stop. The look in the older man's eyes suggested that he was beginning to suspect the supernatural forces they had unleashed. But pride and stubbornness prevented him from acknowledging the possibility that their actions had consequences beyond the merely practical. Instead, he prescribed rest and herbal remedies, speaking of feminine hysteria and the need for spiritual purification. But Iemen could see the fear lurking beneath his confident words. From that night forward, the haunting intensified beyond anything Iemen could have imagined. Oiwa's presence became constant and unavoidable, manifesting not just in visions, but in physical disturbances that affected the entire household. Food would spoil instantly when he touched it. Water would turn bitter in his mouth, and flowers would wither at his approach. The servants began to whisper that he was cursed, and several resigned their positions rather than remain in a house where the very air seemed poisoned by supernatural malevolence. But perhaps most devastating of all was the effect on his relationship with Ume. The shared trauma of that terrible night had created a barrier between them that neither could cross. She began to look at him with suspicion and fear, as if she sensed that he was somehow responsible for the horrors that had invaded their home. Their conversations became stilted and formal, their physical intimacy a source of mutual revulsion rather than comfort. And through it all, Oiwa's voice echoed in his ears, reminding him constantly of the price of betrayal and the impossibility of escape from justice, even beyond the grave. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of fire and gold, the supernatural disturbances in the Ido household reached a crescendo that could no longer be ignored or explained away. What had begun as private torment for Imun had expanded to encompass the entire family, creating an atmosphere of fear and unease that permeated every corner of their once peaceful home. Servants fled in the night, leaving behind hastily scrawled notes of resignation that spoke of evil spirits and cursed ground. Even the most practical members of the merchant community began to cross themselves when passing the Ito gates, and business associates found excuses to conduct their affairs elsewhere. Kihei, his composure finally cracking under the weight of inexplicable events, summoned a succession of priests and spiritual advisors, each more desperate than the last. They performed elaborate purification ceremonies, burned expensive incense, and chanted sutras until their voices grew hoarse, but their efforts seemed only to anger whatever force had taken residence in the house. Sacred Ofuda burst into flame without warning. Blessed water turned black and foul-smelling, and more than one holy man fled the premises, claiming that the very air was thick with malevolent energy. It was during one of these failed exorcism attempts that the truth finally emerged, pulled from the shadows by forces that would no longer be denied. The priest, an elderly man renowned for his ability to commune with restless spirits, had been conducting a ritual in the main hall when he suddenly stopped mid-chant, his eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. When he spoke again, his voice had changed completely, becoming the soft, pain-filled tones of a woman pushed beyond all endurance. "Why do you seek to banish me?" Oiwa's spirit asked through the priest's mouth, causing everyone present to recoil in terror. "Why do you call me evil when I seek only justice for crimes that cry out to heaven for retribution?" Kihei, his face pale but his voice steady, demanded to know what crime the spirit spoke of, what injustice had brought this curse upon his house. In response, the possessed priest began to speak of Oiwa's life and death, revealing details that only those directly involved could have known. The assembled family and retainers listened in growing horror as the story unfolded. The poisoning that had destroyed her beauty, the abandonment by the husband she had loved faithfully, the murder that had been disguised as disappearance, and the callous disposal of her body in the ancient well. When the tale was finished, a terrible silence fell over the room. Ume, who had been clutching her father's arm throughout the recitation, slowly turned to look at her husband with eyes that held the dawning awareness of betrayal. For the first time since their marriage, she was seeing Iman clearly, understanding the true nature of the man she had bound her life to. "Is it true?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind rattling the paper screens. "Did you murder your wife to marry me?" Iman tried to deny it, tried to claim that the spirit was lying or mistaken, but the words died in his throat as he looked into Ume's face and saw his own guilt reflected there. The weight of his crimes, carried in secret for so many months, suddenly seemed unbearable, and he found himself confessing everything: the gradual corruption of his honor, the slow poisoning of Oiwa's beauty, his complicity in her murder, and his cowardice in allowing others to raise his orphaned daughter. The reaction to his confession was swift and devastating. Ome collapsed as if physically struck, her sobs echoing through the house like the cries of a wounded animal. Kihei, his face twisted with rage and disgust, began shouting orders for Iemon's immediate expulsion from their home, declaring that no amount of social advantage was worth the curse that his presence had brought upon them. The few remaining servants who had witnessed the scene scattered like leaves before a storm, carrying word of the scandal to every corner of the district. But even as the human consequences of his actions unfolded around him, Iemon was most aware of the spirit's presence, no longer hidden, but manifesting openly in the center of the room. Oiwa appeared as she had been in life, but transformed by death into something beyond human comprehension. Her beauty had been restored, but it was a terrible beauty that spoke of power drawn from the deepest wells of suffering and transformed into an instrument of inexorable justice. "Now you understand," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos surrounding them, "that there is no refuge from truth, no distance great enough to outrun the consequences of betrayal. You thought that death would silence me, that murder would erase the inconvenience of a wife whose face reminded you of your own corruption. But love betrayed becomes something far more powerful than love protected, and a mother's rage at the theft of her child burns with fires that death cannot extinguish." Iemon tried to speak, tried to offer some word of repentance or explanation, but found that his voice had deserted him completely. He could only stand and watch as the life he had built on the foundation of others' suffering crumbled around him, understanding finally that every moment of happiness he had stolen would be paid for with compound interest. The possessed priest suddenly convulsed and fell to the floor, his own consciousness returning as Oiwa's spirit withdrew. In the confused aftermath, as people rushed to attend to the unconscious holy man and deal with the hysterical Ume, Iemon found himself alone with the ghost of his murdered wife. She looked at him with eyes that held not hatred, but something far more terrible, a cold, implacable determination that promised retribution beyond anything his imagination could conceive. "This is only the beginning," she told him, as her form began to fade like morning mist. "You will leave this house in disgrace, will wander without rest or peace, will know what it means to be truly alone. And always, always, you will carry with you the knowledge of what you have lost, what you have destroyed, what you can never reclaim." As her image dissolved entirely, Iemon was left standing in the wreckage of his second marriage, understanding that the worst was yet to come. Cast out from the Ito household, with nothing but the clothes on his back and the terrible weight of his crimes, Iemon began a period of wandering that would last through the changing of seasons and beyond. His former father-in-law had been thorough in his disgrace, ensuring that word of the spiritual disturbances and their cause spread throughout the merchant community with devastating efficiency. Doors that had once opened readily to welcome the well-connected son-in-law of a prosperous family now remained firmly barred against a man marked by supernatural curse and moral corruption. The first weeks of his exile were perhaps the most difficult, as the comfortable assumptions of his new life fell away one by one. He had grown accustomed to fine food and silk clothing, to servants who anticipated his needs and companions who sought his favor. Now he found himself sleeping rough under bridges and in abandoned temples, begging for work from employers who turned him away as soon as they recognized his name, or heard whispers of his history. But even worse than the physical hardships was the constant awareness of Oiwa's presence. She did not appear to him every night as she had threatened, but her absence was almost more terrible than her manifestations, creating a state of constant anticipation that wore at his nerves like water dripping on stone. He would catch glimpses of her reflection in puddles, hear her voice calling his name through the sound of wind in the trees, feel the touch of cold fingers on his shoulder when he walked alone through crowded streets. Sleep became his enemy, for in dreams the barriers between past and present dissolved entirely. Night after night, he would find himself reliving the early days of his courtship with Oiwa, experiencing again the pure joy of their first meeting, the sweet anticipation of their wedding, the profound contentment of their brief period of happiness. These dreams were more tormenting than any nightmare, for they showed him with pitiless clarity exactly what he had destroyed in his pursuit of material advancement. Other dreams brought visions of his daughter, now growing up in the cold comfort of the Ito household. He saw her asking questions about her mother that were met with evasive answers, saw the way her bright curiosity gradually dimmed as she learned that some subjects were forbidden. Most painfully, he witnessed the moments when she would study her own reflection in mirrors, searching for traces of the mother she could barely remember, trying to understand why her father could not bear to look at her for more than a few moments at a time. As winter tightened its grip on the land, Eamon's wanderings brought him to the outskirts of the district where he had once lived with Oiwa. He told himself that he had come this way by accident, that the familiar paths were simply easier to travel than unknown roads. But in his heart, he knew that he was being drawn by forces beyond his conscious control. The landscape of his former happiness called to him with the irresistible pull of a wound that demands to be probed despite the pain it causes. He avoided the village itself, knowing that he would not be welcome there. But he could not resist walking the forest paths where he and Oiwa had once strolled together in the golden days of their courtship. The trees were bare now, their skeletal branches reaching toward a gray sky like supplicating hands, and the ground was carpeted with dead leaves that crunched beneath his feet with a sound like breaking bones. Every landmark brought fresh memories: the clearing where they had first kissed, the stream where she had washed their clothes while humming songs that made the very air seem lighter, the ancient shrine where they had prayed for their unborn child's health and happiness. It was at this shrine, half hidden by bare branches and thick with the silence of abandonment, that Oiwa finally appeared to him again. He had been kneeling before the crude wooden altar, trying to find words for a prayer that might somehow undo the terrible chain of events he had set in motion. When he became aware of another presence in the sacred space, she materialized slowly, as if gathering substance from the winter air itself, her form more solid and real than it had ever been during her previous manifestations. "Do you remember this place?" she asked, settling beside him on the frozen ground with the fluid grace that had once made his heart race with love and now filled it with dread. "Do you remember the promises we made here? The hopes we shared? The future we planned together?" Eamon found his voice at last, though it came out as little more than a whisper. "I remember everything. I remember. And I am sorry. If I could undo what I have done, if I could bring you back and restore what we had, I would gladly give my life to make it so." Oiwa's expression did not change, but something in her eyes suggested that his words had been heard and weighed. "Remorse is a luxury of the living," she replied. "The dead have no use for apologies, only for justice. But I will ask you this: If you could indeed undo your choices, would you choose differently? If you could return to the moment when Kihei first offered you his daughter's hand and his family's wealth, would you refuse? The question hung between them like a blade, cutting through all his self-justifications and comfortable lies to the truth that lay beneath. Yemen wanted to answer immediately, wanted to declare that he would choose love over gold, honor over advancement, but the words would not come. For he knew, with the terrible clarity that comes only in moments of absolute honesty, that if faced with the same choices again, poverty and struggle with Oiwa, or wealth and ease with another, his fundamental nature would drive him to make the same decision. "I see," Oiwa said softly, and there was something almost like pity in her voice. "You mourn not for my death, but for the consequences of my death. You regret not the betrayal itself, but the fact that betrayal brought punishment rather than reward. Even now, even knowing what your choices have cost, you would choose comfort over conscience if the price were not so high." The truth of her words struck him like a physical blow, and he found himself weeping. Not for her, he realized with shame, but for himself, for the comfortable life he had lost, for the prosperity that had been snatched away just when it seemed secure. His tears fell onto the frozen earth of the shrine, but brought no relief, no absolution, only the bitter taste of self-knowledge. "Then you understand why I cannot rest," Oiwa continued, rising to her feet with the terrible majesty of justice personified. "You understand why death has not ended my purpose, why the grave could not contain my need to see balance restored. You betrayed not just our marriage vows, but the very nature of love itself, transforming what should have been sacred into something base and commercial. Such crimes against the fundamental order of the world demand retribution that transcends the merely mortal." As she spoke, the air around them began to change, taking on the charged quality that precedes a thunderstorm. The bare trees creaked and swayed despite the absence of wind, and the temperature dropped until Eamon's breath formed clouds of vapor that hung in the air like accusations. Other shapes began to materialize around the shrine, the spirits of others who had died unjustly, drawn by the power of Oiwa's accumulated rage and sorrow. "Your punishment will be to live," she declared, her voice taking on the weight of supernatural authority. "To live with the full knowledge of what you have done, and the absolute certainty that you will never escape its consequences. You will wander without rest, without peace, without the comfort of human connection, carrying your crimes like stones in your heart until the day you die. And even then, even in death, you will find no relief, for the debts you have incurred will follow you into whatever realm awaits beyond this world." The vision faded as suddenly as it had come, leaving Iemen alone in the abandoned shrine with only the sound of wind through bare branches and the terrible weight of prophecy settling on his shoulders like a funeral shroud. He remained kneeling there until nightfall, understanding finally that his punishment was not something that would come to him in the future, but something that had already begun, would continue through all his remaining days, and would follow him beyond the grave into whatever judgment awaited. The seasons turned with relentless indifference as Yemen continued his cursed wandering, each day bringing fresh confirmation of Oiwa's prophecy. Spring arrived with its burden of renewal and hope, but he found no comfort in the flowering trees or the songs of returning birds. The very beauty of the awakening world seemed to mock his isolation, reminding him of all the simple pleasures he had forfeited in his pursuit of material gain. When cherry blossoms fell like snow on the paths he walked, he could not help but remember the tree under which he and Oiwa had pledged their love. and the sight filled him with such anguish that he would avoid those places where spring displayed its glory most freely. Work became increasingly difficult to find as his reputation spread through the network of connections that bound the merchant class together. Employers who might have overlooked moral failings in exchange for useful skills were unwilling to risk the supernatural disturbances that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Tools would break in his hands, animals would shy away from his touch, and more than one business establishment reported strange occurrences: spoiled goods, unexplained noises, and the persistent feeling of being watched by unseen eyes that began only after hiring him and ceased immediately upon his departure. The few people who showed him kindness quickly learned to regret their compassion. An innkeeper who offered him shelter found his establishment plagued by a series of accidents that drove away customers and brought him to the edge of bankruptcy. A Buddhist monk who tried to counsel him on the path of redemption was struck by a mysterious illness that left him bedridden for months, speaking deliriously of visions that filled him with horror. Even chance encounters with strangers could bring misfortune. A merchant who shared his food with the hungry wanderer discovered that his entire caravan had been infested with rats, and a farmer who allowed him to sleep in his barn woke to find his crops withered and blackened as if touched by frost. But perhaps most terrible of all were the nights when Oiwa chose to manifest directly, appearing to him in whatever shelter he had found, with a presence that had grown more substantial and terrible with each passing month. No longer did she need to work through dreams or peripheral visions. She could stand before him as solid and real as any living person, her beauty restored, but transformed into something that inspired dread rather than desire. These encounters had become conversations of a sort, though they brought no comfort or understanding, only the steady accumulation of despair that seemed to be her ultimate purpose. Do you see how completely you are cut off from human fellowship? She would ask him during these nocturnal visitations, her voice carrying the cold authority of absolute judgment. Do you understand that this isolation is not merely punishment, but revelation? You are experiencing now what I felt in those final days, the complete abandonment by those who should have protected and cherished you, the bitter knowledge that your suffering means nothing to those who caused it. These conversations always followed a similar pattern, with Oiwa methodically stripping away whatever small comforts or rationalizations he had managed to construct since their last meeting. If he had found temporary work, she would remind him of how quickly it would end and how completely he would be rejected once his nature became known. If he had enjoyed a moment of peace, or even fleeting happiness, she would contrast it with the permanent desolation he had inflicted upon her and their daughter. If he expressed any hope for eventual redemption or forgiveness, she would laugh with a sound like winter wind through dead leaves and remind him that some crimes echo through eternity. You still do not understand the true nature of what you have done, she told him during one particularly devastating encounter, as late autumn rain drummed against the walls of the abandoned temple where he had taken shelter. You think of your crimes in terms of personal betrayal, a husband who abandoned his wife, a father who orphaned his child. But the corruption you embraced reaches far deeper than individual suffering. You violated the fundamental trust that holds society together, the sacred bonds that make civilized life possible. When a man can poison his wife's beauty to justify abandoning her, when love can be discarded like a worn-out garment the moment it becomes inconvenient, what meaning do any of our human connections retain? As she spoke, the air around them filled with images, not visions of the past this time, but glimpses of futures that would never be. He saw his daughter growing to womanhood, with the knowledge that her father had murdered her mother, saw how that terrible inheritance would poison every relationship she tried to form. He witnessed the children she might have had with a loving husband who could see past the shadow of her birth, children who would never exist because no decent man would risk binding his family to such a cursed lineage. He observed the gradual spread of cynicism and mistrust through the community, as people who had known their story began to question whether any marriage vow could be trusted, whether any declaration of love carried genuine meaning. "This is your true legacy," Oiwa declared as the visions faded. "Not merely the destruction of one woman and one child, but the erosion of faith itself. Every person who knows our story will love a little less trustingly, will hold back some portion of their heart against the possibility of betrayal. The damage you have done spreads like poison in a well, contaminating everything it touches for generations yet unborn." The weight of this expanded understanding settled on Iman's shoulders like a mountain, and he began to comprehend why death offered no escape from his punishment. The consequences of his actions would outlive him by centuries, passed down through stories and whispers, until his name became synonymous with the ultimate betrayal of trust. Even if he lived 1,000 years and spent every day in penitence, he could never undo the damage he had inflicted on the very fabric of human faith. As winter returned with its familiar burden of cold and isolation, Iman found himself drawn once again to the district where his crimes had been committed. He told himself that he was seeking the abandoned well where Oiwa's body lay, thinking perhaps that if he could retrieve her remains and give them proper burial, some portion of her anger might be appeased. But deep in his heart, he knew that his true motivation was simpler and more selfish. He wanted to see his daughter, to look upon the child he had orphaned, and perhaps find in her face some echo of the love he had destroyed. The journey back to familiar territory was more difficult than he had expected, not because of physical obstacles, but because of the way the very landscape seemed to resist his presence. Paths that he remembered as straight and clear now twisted and doubled back on themselves, leading him in circles that left him exhausted and disoriented. Streams that had once provided fresh water turned bitter at his approach, and wildlife fled from his vicinity as if sensing some fundamental wrongness in his nature. By the time he reached the edges of his former home district, he understood that even the natural world had turned against him, recognizing him as something that had placed itself outside the normal order of existence. The village itself had changed in the months since his disgrace and exile. Where once there had been a sense of bustling prosperity, now an atmosphere of unease hung over the streets like morning fog that refused to lift. Shutters that had once stood open to welcome neighbors and customers now remained firmly closed, and people hurried through their daily business with downcast eyes and nervous glances over their shoulders. It was as if the entire community had been infected by the supernatural malevolence that his actions had unleashed, transforming a place of normal human activity into something haunted and fearful. He learned from overheard conversations that the changes had begun shortly after his departure, when reports of his crimes and their supernatural consequences had spread through the merchant networks. At first, people had dismissed the stories as superstitious nonsense, but gradually strange incidents began occurring throughout the district. Children would wake screaming from nightmares they could not remember, speaking of a sad woman who stood at the foot of their beds, weeping silent tears. Mirrors would crack without explanation, always in patterns that seemed to suggest a face twisted by suffering. Wells and streams that had provided pure water for generations began to develop an unpleasant taste that no amount of filtering could remove. Most disturbing of all were the reports of a ghostly figure seen wandering the area around the old well where Oiwa's body had been disposed of. Travelers on the forest paths spoke of glimpsing a woman in white whose beauty was marred by terrible disfigurement, who would appear suddenly in their peripheral vision before vanishing when they turned to look directly. Those who encountered her reported feeling overwhelmed by an inexplicable sadness that lingered for days afterward, as if they had been touched by a grief too vast for human comprehension. The Ito family, once the most prosperous and influential merchants in the region, had suffered a dramatic reversal of fortune that many attributed to supernatural causes. Their business ventures failed one after another with a consistency that defied natural explanation. Their health declined despite the best medical care available, and their once grand house stood increasingly empty as servants fled and guests found excuses to decline invitations. Kihei himself had aged decades in a matter of months, his hair turning white and his face developing lines that spoke of constant worry and fear. Most painful of all for Iemen was the news about Ume, his abandoned second wife. The trauma of that terrible night when Oiwa's spirit had possessed her consciousness had left her mentally shattered, unable to distinguish between her own memories and the experiences of the murdered woman whose essence had temporarily inhabited her body. She spent her days in a state of confused anguish, sometimes believing herself to be Oiwa, seeking vengeance for her murder, other times recognizing herself, but being unable to escape the memories of poison and betrayal that had been burned into her mind. The finest physicians in the region had been consulted, but none could offer any treatment for an ailment that transcended the merely physical. As for his daughter, the child for whom he had ostensibly committed his crimes, she had been moved from the Ito household to a distant temple where the Buddhist nuns specialized in caring for children marked by supernatural circumstances. The official explanation was that she required spiritual protection from the curse that had claimed her parents. But Iemen suspected the truth was simpler. No one wanted the responsibility of raising a child whose very existence reminded them of the terrible price of betrayal and murder. The knowledge that his daughter was being raised in virtual exile, cut off from normal human contact and branded as somehow tainted by his crimes, filled Iemen with a despair that went beyond anything he had previously experienced. He had told himself that his actions were justified by his desire to provide her with a better life, to ensure that she grew up in comfort and security, rather than the poverty that had marked his marriage to Oiwa. Instead, he had condemned her to a fate worse than orphanhood. She would go through life bearing the weight of his sins, forever marked as the daughter of a man who had murdered for money and convenience. It was this realization that finally drove him to seek out the well where Oiwa's body lay, not in any hope of redemption, but simply to complete the circle of his destruction. If he could not undo what he had done, if his daughter's life was already ruined beyond repair, then perhaps the only honorable action remaining was to join his victim in death and spare the world his continued existence. The journey to the well took him through the darkest parts of the forest, along paths that seemed to shift and change as he walked them, as if the very earth was trying to prevent him from reaching his destination. The trees grew more twisted and bare as he penetrated deeper into the woods, their branches reaching toward each other across the path like gnarled fingers trying to block out the sky. No birds sang in this portion of the forest, no insects hummed, and even the wind seemed muted and strange, carrying scents of decay and stagnant water that had no visible source. When he finally reached the clearing where the ancient well stood, he found it transformed into something that belonged more to nightmare than the waking world. The wooden covering that had once protected travelers from falling into its depths had rotted away completely, leaving only a dark mouth that seemed to exhale the breath of the underworld. The stones that lined its rim were stained with something that looked like dried blood, and the water far below reflected no light, appearing instead as a pool of absolute darkness that seemed to drink in illumination like a hungry void. But most terrible of all was the presence that emanated from that cursed pit. Not just Oiwa's spirit, but something larger and more encompassing, as if the well had become a gateway through which all the suffering and injustice of the world could pour forth into the realm of the living. Standing at its edge, Aimon could feel the weight of every betrayal ever committed, every trust broken, every innocent life destroyed for the sake of convenience or gain. The knowledge was crushing in its immensity, and he understood that what he faced was not merely the vengeance of one murdered woman, but the accumulated judgment of every victim who had ever cried out for justice and been denied. "You have come at last." Oiwa's voice spoke from the depths of the well, though her form remained invisible in the supernatural darkness below. "You have seen what your choices have wrought, have witnessed the spreading poison of your corruption, have felt the weight of consequences that will outlive you by generations. Do you finally understand the true nature of what you have done?" Eamon tried to speak, tried to offer some word of acknowledgement or repentance, but found that language had become inadequate to express the enormity of his comprehension. Instead, he simply nodded, knowing somehow that she could see the gesture despite the darkness that separated them. "Then you understand why there can be no forgiveness," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. "Some crimes are too fundamental, too destructive of the basic trust that makes civilization possible, to be absolved by mere repentance. You have not simply murdered one woman. You have dealt a blow to the very concept of love itself, have made it impossible for others to believe fully in the promises they make or receive. This damage cannot be undone by any action you might take, cannot be healed by any suffering you might endure." The truth of her words settled on him with the weight of natural law, and he found himself accepting her judgment not with resignation, but with something approaching relief. For months he had carried the burden of hoping for redemption, of believing that somehow his crimes might be forgiven, or at least balanced by sufficient penance. The knowledge that no such balance was possible, that his debt could never be paid, freed him from the exhausting effort of seeking absolution and allowed him to face the full reality of what he had become. "Yet you will not die," Oiwa declared, as if reading his thoughts. "Death would be mercy, and mercy is not what justice demands. You will live carrying this knowledge, wearing it like a garment that can never be removed. You will walk through the world as a living reminder of the price of betrayal, and all who encounter you will sense the corruption that marks your soul. Your very existence will serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to follow your path, showing them the ultimate destination of choices that place material gain above sacred trust." As she spoke, Eamon felt something fundamental change within him, as if the last vestiges of his humanity were being stripped away and replaced with something harder and colder. The capacity for hope, for joy, for any emotion save the grinding awareness of his crimes seemed to drain out of him like blood from a mortal wound. What remained was not quite human and not quite spirit, but something caught between the two states, a creature designed to serve as both warning and punishment for as long as the world endured. Years passed, though time itself seemed to have little meaning for the thing that Eamon had become. Seasons changed, governments rose and fell, and the Japan he had known transformed itself in ways that would have seemed impossible in his human life. Yet, through all these changes, he remained constant, a figure of warning and despair, who appeared at moments when others faced choices similar to those that had destroyed him. Young men who contemplated betraying faithful wives for the promise of wealthier matches would find him standing in their path, his very presence radiating the consequences of such choices. Merchants who considered poisoning competitors or cheating trusted partners would encounter him in their dreams, forced to confront the ultimate destination of their planned corruption. Women who thought to steal husbands from loving wives would see him watching from shadows, his hollow eyes reflecting the emptiness that awaited those who built happiness on others' suffering. He became a figure of legend, though few who told his story understood the full truth of his nature. Parents would frighten misbehaving children with tales of the wandering ghost who punished those who broke promises or betrayed trust. Lovers would pledge fidelity by swearing to remain true even should Ayamon's spirit demand otherwise. His name became synonymous with the ultimate violation of sacred bonds, a cautionary tale that grew more powerful with each telling. But perhaps most remarkably, Oiwa's presence grew stronger rather than weaker as the decades passed. Rather than finding peace in the administration of justice, her spirit seemed to draw power from each act of retribution, each moment when Yemen's continued existence prevented another from following his path. She appeared to him regularly, no longer as an agent of personal vengeance, but as something approaching a force of nature, the embodiment of every promise made and broken, every trust given and betrayed. "Do you see how justice works?" she would ask him during these encounters, which had taken on the quality of formal lessons rather than personal confrontations. Not through simple revenge, but through the prevention of future crimes. Your punishment serves a purpose beyond your own suffering. It protects others from the temptation to follow your example, shows them the true cost of choices that seem to offer easy gain at others' expense. As the modern world emerged around them, bringing with it new forms of betrayal and corruption that the ancient codes had never imagined, both Oiwa and Ayamon found their roles expanding. Financial fraud, corporate malfeasance, political corruption. All of these contemporary sins carried echoes of the original crime that had bound them together in this eternal dance of guilt and retribution. The fundamental human capacity to justify harm for personal gain remained constant, regardless of the specific forms that such justification might take. In the final twilight of the tale, as mist rises from valleys that have witnessed countless stories of love and loss, we see Ayamon still walking the paths between villages, his footsteps silent on roads that lead nowhere and everywhere. Behind him, invisible to mortal eyes, but felt by every sensitive soul, follows the spirit of Oiwa, no longer the broken woman who died in an abandoned well, but transformed into something both terrible and necessary, a guardian of the sacred bonds that hold human society together. Their story has become part of the very fabric of the land, woven into the wind that sighs through cherry blossoms and the rain that falls on unmarked graves. Every marriage ceremony carries an echo of their tragedy. Every promise made between lovers bears the weight of their example. In the end, they have achieved a kind of immortality that neither had sought in life, not the gentle remembrance reserved for the virtuous, but the stark permanence of those whose choices become warnings for all who follow. And so, the tale continues, not with an ending, but with the promise of eternal vigilance. For as long as human hearts are capable of betrayal, as long as the weak can be tempted to harm the innocent for personal gain, the spirits of Oiwa and Iman will walk among us. She as the guardian of trust, he as the living consequence of its violation. Their story serves as both comfort and warning. Comfort for those who choose honor over advantage. Warning for those who would sacrifice love for gold. In the deepest night, when wind rattles the shutters and shadows take on shapes that reason cannot explain, listen carefully to the sounds that drift through darkness. You may hear the soft pad of bare feet on wooden floors, the rustle of silk kimono moving through rooms where no living person walks. These are the sounds of Oiwa keeping her eternal watch, ensuring that the bonds of trust and love remain sacred, that the price of betrayal is never forgotten. Sleep well, knowing that in a world where such guardians maintain their vigil, justice may be delayed but never denied. And love, true love, remains the most powerful force in both the world of the living and the realm of spirits.